She was counting her last coins at the checkout, barely holding it together, when the man behind her, dressed in a $1,000 coat, suddenly froze at the sight of her daughter. Not because he recognized the woman, but because the little girl looked exactly like him when he was a child, and he had no idea who the mother was. Rachel Meyer stood at the checkout counter, her hand trembling slightly as she counted out the coins in her palm. They were warm from her grip, a mix of nickels, dimes, and a few quarters, all gathered from coat pockets, old purses, and the bottom of a kitchen drawer. Just enough, she hoped, for a small pack of diapers and 2 jars of baby food. Behind her, her 2-year-old daughter Sophie rested on her hip, her thumb in her mouth, eyes wide and sleepy. Rachel rocked her gently from side to side while keeping her eyes on the register. The cashier, a young guy barely out of high school, seemed nervous watching her sort the change. The line behind her grew longer. Rachel didn't look back. She couldn't afford the stairs today. "I think that's $6.82, she said quietly, pushing the last few coins forward. The cashier hesitated, glanced at the screen, and then started counting the coins himself. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. A man's voice, deep, impatient. Rachel glanced over her shoulder. The man standing next in line was tall, dressed sharply in a dark coat, holding nothing but a bottle of mineral water and a coffee. His posture was tight, like he didn't belong in places like this. Everything about him, from his polished shoes to the watch on his wrist, spoke of wealth, confidence, control. He looked mildly annoyed, but then something shifted. His eyes fell on Sophie. For a moment, everything froze. Sophie, resting her cheek on Rachel's shoulder, looked directly at the man. Her eyes, wide and light gray-green, caught his in a way that made his breath catch. His expression changed, from distant to focused, then startled. He didn't move. He didn't speak. It wasn't just that the child was beautiful. It was that she looked familiar, almost unsettlingly so. He couldn't place it right away, but something in the shape of her face, the color of her eyes, it triggered a memory. Or more accurately, a mirror. He was staring at a version of himself, but smaller, softer, female. The man, David Lorne, took an unconscious step forward. Rachel, feeling the motion behind her, turned fully now, her body shifting protectively in front of Sophie. "Everything okay?" she asked, guarded. David blinked. He looked startled by her voice, as if pulled out of a trance. "Yes," he said quickly. Then he added, "Actually, let me take care of that." Rachel frowned. "Excuse me?" He stepped up beside her and handed his credit card to the cashier. "I'll pay for the diapers and baby food," he said, tone matter of fact, but his voice a touch softer now. "Please." Rachel stiffened. "No, that's really not necessary. I've got it." "It's okay," he said, cutting her off gently. "It's nothing." She didn't know what to do. Pride told her to refuse. But Sophie was already drifting to sleep, and Rachel didn't have the energy to argue. She nodded stiffly. "Thank you." David didn't say anything else. He just nodded and took a small step back. Rachel gathered the bag and walked out quickly, her cheeks burning. Outside the store, cold wind slapped her face. Sophie stirred in her arms, murmured something sleepy, then nestled closer. Rachel sat on the bus bench, exhausted. She didn't look back through the store window. Inside, David was still standing there, frozen, staring at the place she had just been. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. That child looked exactly like him when he was 2 years old. David Lorne sat alone in his high-rise apartment that evening, a glass of untouched scotch resting on the sleek coffee table in front of him. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glittering lights of the city skyline, but he barely noticed them. His mind was still stuck in the grocery store, caught in the brief but unshakable moment when that little girl, Sophie, looked up at him. Those eyes, that bone structure, that exact slope of the nose, that unspoken something in her face that felt like looking at an old photograph of himself. He hadn't been able to explain it, still couldn't, and yet it haunted him with quiet certainty. He stood abruptly and walked to the bookshelf, reaching for an old leather-bound photo album. It was dusty. He hadn't touched it in years. Flipping through the pages, he passed childhood birthdays, holidays, vacations, and then he stopped. There it was, a photo from when he was 2, sitting on his mother's lap in the backyard of their old house in Boston. He remembered almost nothing about that day, but the image had always stood out to him, his unruly light hair, wide greenish-gray eyes, and round cheeks. The resemblance to Sophie was now impossible to unsee, but that wasn't what made his pulse quicken. On the edge of the photo, someone else's arm was visible. Young, female, wearing a bracelet that he recognized instantly. His mother's best friend had that bracelet, a woman named Amy. She'd been around when he was a teenager, only for one summer, and then she was gone. He flipped the photo over. In faded handwriting it read, David, 1985, backyard, with Amy and me. His mother had always been evasive about that summer. She claimed Amy had just needed a place to stay, but David remembered tension in the house, whispers behind closed doors, late-night conversations that stopped the second he walked into a room. Amy had been pregnant. The memory hit him like a jolt. She was young, barely 20, and his mother had said Amy left suddenly and never came back. No one ever said why. He set the photo down and walked to his desk, opening his laptop. He typed quickly, Amy Blake, Boston, 1985, birth records. Nothing. He tried again with variations. Hospital archives, obituaries, public court files. Then finally, Amy Blake, death during childbirth, Massachusetts, 1999. A single record appeared. Amy Blake, age 33, died due to complications in labor. Child, female. No father listed. The date matched. David leaned back, hands cold. He suddenly realized why Sophie looked like him. Why Rachel did too, in subtler ways. Her eyes, her chin, something about her posture. Because Rachel was Amy's daughter. And if Amy had been pregnant that summer in 1999, and his mother had helped hide it, then it meant only one thing. David was Rachel's half-brother. He stood motionless in the darkened room, the weight of it pressing on his chest. He had a sister, a niece, and he had just walked away from them. The next morning, Rachel sat at the small kitchen table in her one-bedroom apartment, watching Sophie nibble on a piece of toast. The sun filtered weakly through the blinds, casting thin, golden lines across the cluttered floor. A pile of unopened mail sat near the door, mostly bills she couldn't pay. Her phone buzzed with a text from her part-time employer. Another shift cut. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to quiet the rising panic. She had gotten used to living on the edge, but yesterday at the grocery store still lingered in her chest like a bruise. The man David had unsettled her, not because he was rude or threatening. In fact, it was the opposite. His politeness, the way he looked at Sophie, the stunned silence in his expression. It wasn't normal. It was like he saw something in her daughter that even she didn't see. Rachel shook off the thought and leaned over to wipe jam from Sophie's cheek. "You're sticky, silly," she whispered, kissing the top of her head. Sophie giggled, completely unbothered by the world. Meanwhile, across town, David sat in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, staring out the tinted window with a knot in his stomach. He was on his way to his company's downtown office, but his mind was nowhere near quarterly reports or investor calls. He was still thinking about Rachel, about Amy, about the child she had died giving birth to. It was all making a horrifying sort of sense now. Back in 1999, he was only 16. Amy Blake had been close to his mother, practically living with them that summer while going through a hard time. His father was distant, cold, always busy. There had been arguments, slammed doors, secret phone calls. Then one day, Amy was gone. His mother told him she had moved out of state. No explanation. Now David knew the truth. Amy had been pregnant, and not just with any man's child, with his father's. That meant Rachel was his half-sister. And Sophie, the little girl in the grocery store, was his niece. He felt sick to his stomach. But what made it worse was this. Rachel didn't know any of it. She thought she was alone, and she was barely surviving. By mid-afternoon, he couldn't stay in his office another minute. He canceled a meeting, stepped into the elevator, and gave his driver a new address, the one he'd gotten from the private background check. 20 minutes later, he was standing at the edge of a modest apartment complex, holding a bag of groceries he'd picked up on the way. It felt awkward. He hated the idea of showing up unannounced, but something told him she might not answer if he called. He hesitated at the door, then knocked twice. Inside, Rachel froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her heart started to race. She scooped Sophie into her arms and crept toward the door, peering through the peephole. It was him, the man from the grocery store. She almost didn't open it, but something in his eyes, nervous, even gentle, stopped her. She unlocked the chain and opened the door halfway. "You again," she said cautiously. "Did I drop something at the store?" "No," David said quickly, holding up the grocery bag. I, I hope you don't find this inappropriate. I just wanted to bring something for your daughter." Rachel stared at him, confused. "Why?" He exhaled, searching her face. "Because I think I might know who your mother was." That made her freeze. "What did you say?" He took a step back, giving her space. "Can I explain? I swear I'm not here for anything strange. I need to tell you something. And maybe you'll think I'm crazy. But I have proof." Rachel looked at Sophie, who was watching the man curiously, then back at him. "You've got 2 minutes." David nodded, heart pounding. "Your mother's name was Amy Blake. She died giving birth to you, right?" Rachel's lips parted slowly. "How do you know that?" He swallowed hard. "Because I think she was pregnant by my father. And that means you and I are family." Rachel stared at him. And in that moment, her entire world began to tilt. Rachel stood frozen in the doorway, her heart thudding in her chest like it wanted to break free. The words hung in the air between them. Absurd, impossible, terrifying. Family? She looked at the man again. David, wealthy, composed, deliberate. There was a quiet intensity in his face, but no aggression. Just something else. Something she couldn't name. Guilt? Grief? "You're saying your father was my father?" Her voice was shaky, skeptical. David nodded slowly. "I know how it sounds, but I've been piecing this together since yesterday. I remembered your mother, Amy. She lived with us when I was 16. My mother said she was going through something. She just disappeared one day. They never told me anything, but I found a birth record from 1999. Amy Blake. She died in childbirth. The date matches. There's no father listed. But I remember my dad being different that summer, angry, secretive." Rachel stared at him, blinking. "My foster family never told me anything. I always assumed I was just a random tragedy. I never even saw a photo of my mother. And now you're saying your father was mine?" "I can't prove it yet," David said. "But I want to. I need to. If it's true, you're my sister. And Sophie..." He looked at the child in her arms. "She's my niece." Rachel stepped back instinctively, holding Sophie tighter. "I'm sorry," he added quickly. "I didn't mean to scare you." She didn't reply right away. Her mind was spinning. It was too much. Too fast. She had spent her entire life building a wall between herself and the world. No family, no roots, no history. Just survival. And now this man was standing at her door, telling her everything she believed about herself was wrong. "Why are you even doing this?" she asked finally. "You could have just walked away. You don't owe me anything." David lowered his gaze. "That's the problem. I think I do." The hallway went quiet again, the sounds of traffic muffled by the thin apartment walls. Rachel stared down at Sophie, who had grown quiet in her arms, content to watch the stranger with the deep voice and kind eyes. Rachel stepped aside. "You'd better come in." David entered slowly, unsure where to put himself in the cramped space. He looked around. The apartment was clean but worn. Frayed rug, secondhand furniture, a few children's books and toys scattered neatly in a corner. He set the grocery bag down on the counter without a word. Rachel sat across from him at the small kitchen table. Sophie climbed into her lap, clutching a soft toy rabbit. "You said you have proof," Rachel said. "What is it?" David took a folded photo out of his coat pocket. It was old, worn around the edges. He passed it to her carefully. "That's me. I was 2, sitting in my backyard. And the woman next to me, half in the frame, that's Amy." Rachel stared at the picture. Her hand trembled. There wasn't much of the woman's face, but the long, wavy hair, the necklace. Rachel recognized it. A chain she still had, locked away in a box. The only thing her foster parents let her keep. She looked up at David. "That's her." David exhaled. "I thought so." They sat in silence. There were no words for what was unfolding. No instructions for how to process a life rewritten in a day. Eventually, Rachel said, "If this is true, Then what happens now? David's voice was soft. Whatever you want to happen. I'm not here to force anything. I just wanted to find the truth. And if you want to walk away, I'll respect that. But if you want to know more about Amy or my family or anything, I'm here. And if you ever need help, I'm here for that too. Rachel looked down at Sophie. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone, and that terrified her more than anything. I don't know what I want yet, she admitted. David nodded. That's okay. I'll wait. And in that moment, something shifted. Not a breakthrough, but the beginning of one. The days that followed were marked by a quiet tension Rachel couldn't shake. Every time Sophie giggled or flashed that bright, curious smile, Rachel would catch herself staring, wondering how much of her child came from a history she never knew she had. She couldn't stop thinking about David. His words replayed in her head at night when the apartment was still. If you want to know more, I'm here. She hadn't responded to his text after he left. She wasn't ignoring him out of anger. It was fear. Fear of letting someone into her life when she'd spent years learning how to live without anyone. But more than that, it was fear of hope. Hope that she actually belonged somewhere. Hope that Sophie might grow up with a family. Then 4 days later, David messaged again. Not pushing, just simple. There's a DNA test kit at your door. You don't have to take it, but if you do, I'll be waiting. Rachel opened the door and found a small box on the welcome mat. She stared at it for a long time, then brought it inside. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, she sat at the kitchen table and took a deep breath. It was just a test, a sample, but to her it felt like touching fire. She mailed it the next morning. The weight nearly broke her. Meanwhile, David tried to carry on with life as usual. Board meetings, calls with investors, endless policy memos, but his thoughts kept drifting. He realized how empty his routines were. Everything had always been about control, distance, structure, but now he found himself reading about child development, printing old photos, walking into rooms and forgetting what he came for. The test results arrived 10 days later. David opened the email in his office, hands trembling. It confirmed what they already suspected. 99.97% probability of half-sibling relationship. Rachel was his sister, and that meant Sophie was his niece. He didn't call her immediately. He sat there for a full 10 minutes, staring out the window, swallowing the weight of it. He should have felt relief, but instead he felt grief. For the years lost. For Amy. For the silence that had cost them all so much. When he finally called Rachel, her voice was quiet. I read it too, she said. I guess it's real now. Yeah, he said. It's real. She hesitated. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything, he replied gently. But I was thinking, would you and Sophie want to come to the house sometime? Just to talk. No pressure. Rachel didn't answer right away. Her walls were still up, but they were no longer stone. More like glass. Transparent, fragile. Okay, she said. Maybe just for a little while. That weekend, Rachel stood in front of the largest house she'd ever seen. It wasn't flashy. It was tasteful, quiet, set behind a row of tall trees. But to her, it still looked like another world. David opened the door himself, dressed casually for once, in jeans and a soft gray sweater. He looked nervous, which helped. Sophie clung to Rachel's hand but lit up when she saw the backyard through the hallway window. David gave them a tour, slow, respectful. There was a room filled with books, a kitchen so clean it didn't look real. And then a room David had prepared himself, soft carpet, beanbag chairs, shelves of toys. I thought Sophie might want a space, he said quietly. If you ever wanted to visit again. Rachel stood in the doorway, stunned. No one had ever done something like that for her child, not even close. And when Sophie ran in, squealing with joy, hugging a stuffed bear bigger than she was, Rachel's heart broke in the best way. That night after dinner, Rachel stood with David on the porch. The evening air was cool, but gentle. She really likes you, Rachel said, arms crossed over her chest. David smiled faintly. She's kind of impossible not to like. I still don't know what this means, she added. Being family. We didn't grow up together. We don't know each other. No, we don't, he agreed. But we can start. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Why are you really doing all this? He paused, then said, because you matter. She matters. And I can't change the past. but I can show up for the future. For the first time, Rachel didn't look away. Okay, she said softly. Let's see what that looks like. The weeks that followed moved slowly, like stepping stones across a river Rachel had never dared to cross. At first, she and Sophie visited David's house once a week. Short visits, polite conversation, small attempts at connection. Sophie adapted faster than Rachel did. The little girl clung to David's legs like he had always been there. She drew him pictures, asked endless questions, and sometimes fell asleep on his shoulder during quiet afternoons in the reading room he'd made for her. Rachel, meanwhile, kept her distance. She smiled, she said thank you, but her guard stayed high. Years of disappointment had made her cautious. She wasn't used to kindness without strings. It was easier to expect people to leave, but David didn't. One afternoon, while Sophie was napping on the sofa wrapped in a blanket, Rachel found herself sitting on the back patio with David, sipping tea in silence. The sky was overcast, soft gray clouds hanging low. It felt like a day for truths. "Can I ask you something?" Rachel said, her voice careful. "Of course," David replied. "Why didn't your father ever acknowledge me? Or my mom, if he knew about her?" David exhaled slowly. Because he was a coward. A wealthy, powerful coward who protected his image more than his family. He controlled everything in his world, and a child outside his marriage would have threatened that. My mother probably helped cover it up. And Amy, she was just a girl. Alone. Vulnerable. Rachel's eyes narrowed. So he just let her die? David's jaw tightened. I don't know if he even knew she died. My mother said Amy left and didn't want to be found. I never questioned it. Until now. Silence settled between them. He died 3 years ago, David added. Heart attack. I never really forgave him. Not even before this. Rachel looked out at the trees lining the backyard, her thoughts somewhere far behind them. You said your mother's still alive? David nodded. In a care home. Early onset dementia. Some days she remembers. Some days she thinks I'm still a teenager. Rachel hesitated. Would she remember Amy? She might. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Amy. Her mother. A name, a memory, a blank space. What did she sound like? What kind of laugh did she have? Did she love music? Books? Was she scared when she went into labor? Was she alone? David had answers. Maybe not all, but more than anyone else ever had. The next day she asked him, could I see where Amy lived? Where she stayed that summer? David didn't hesitate. Yes, I'll take you. They drove out to the old family house together, a big Victorian place in a quieter suburb. The property had been sold years ago, but David had kept photos. On the way, he told her about that summer. How Amy would sit under the big oak tree in the backyard and read for hours. How she once taught him how to make pancakes with too much vanilla. How she sang when she thought no one was listening. She was kind, he said, and lonely. Rachel didn't speak. She just nodded, eyes stinging. Back at David's home that night, Rachel tucked Sophie into bed in the guest room. As she turned off the lamp, Sophie whispered, Uncle David is nice. Rachel smiled softly. Yeah, he really is. Later, while sitting on the porch, Rachel turned to David and said something she hadn't said to anyone in years. I don't feel alone anymore. David looked at her, surprised. You're not. She nodded more to herself than to him. I think I want to stay for a while, if that's okay. David didn't answer right away. He just smiled, gently, fully. It's more than okay, he said. Welcome home. The morning air was quiet and soft, filled with the low hum of birdsong and the occasional sound of Sophie's laughter drifting from the backyard. Rachel stood at the kitchen window, watching her daughter play with a small plastic watering can, carefully drenching the soil of a flower bed David had let her adopt. It had only been a month since Rachel and Sophie had started living with David. Part-time 3 nights a week, then 4. But the rhythm had begun to feel natural, even safe. Rachel sipped her coffee slowly, thinking about how quickly everything had changed. A few months ago, she couldn't afford diapers. Now she lived in a house where someone cared if she slept, if she smiled, if she had a bad dream. Not just someone, her brother, her real brother. David entered the kitchen, fresh from his morning run. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt and jogging pants, his hair damp with sweat. He nodded to her and poured himself a glass of water. She's watering weeds again, he said with a tired smile, glancing out the window. Rachel smirked. She says they look lonely. David chuckled, then leaned against the counter. I was thinking, maybe it's time we talk to my mother. Rachel stiffened. She remembers? Some days, yes. Some days she doesn't know who I am. But I think she might remember Amy. Maybe even you. Rachel looked down at the floor. What if she regrets it? What if she doesn't want to remember? David shook his head. You deserve the truth, even if it's incomplete. After a long pause, Rachel said, Okay, let's go. The nursing home was quiet and well kept. David greeted the staff like old friends. Rachel kept close to him, unsure, tense. The room was filled with soft light and the scent of lavender. His mother, Elaine, sat in a recliner by the window, wrapped in a cream-colored shawl, her hands resting gently on her lap. She looked up when they entered. Her eyes, pale blue and still sharp, immediately locked on David. Is it Tuesday? She asked with a small smile. It's Friday, Mom, he said gently. I brought someone I'd like you to meet. Elaine's eyes drifted to Rachel. She studied her face slowly, her gaze lingering longer than Rachel expected. Then her expression changed. Confusion, recognition, sorrow. Are you Amy's baby? Rachel's throat went dry. Yes, she whispered. Elaine closed her eyes, tears forming behind the lids. I tried to protect her, she said softly, but I failed. He said she had to leave, that it would ruin everything. Rachel stepped forward, kneeling beside the old woman. What happened? Elaine opened her eyes again, her voice trembling. Your mother. She was so young and scared. I loved her like a daughter, but my husband, he was ruthless. When I found out she was pregnant, I tried to send her somewhere safe. A private clinic. I thought she'd come back, but she never did. I thought the baby was gone too. I wasn't, Rachel said quietly. I ended up in foster care. Elaine reached out with a frail hand and touched Rachel's cheek. I'm sorry for everything. David watched from the side, arms crossed tightly over his chest, but his eyes were wet. He'd never heard his mother speak so clearly about that time, about the choices she made, the silence she kept. They sat there for a while. No one said much more, but the air between them was different now, less heavy, less hollow. Rachel had come looking for pieces, and here, in this quiet room, she had found at least one. On the drive home, Rachel stared out the window, thinking. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel resentful. What she felt was something she hadn't expected. Relief. David glanced over at her. You okay? Yeah, she said softly. I think I finally am. That night, as Rachel tucked Sophie into bed, the little girl looked up at her with half-lidded eyes and whispered, Mommy, do we live here now? Rachel paused, then smiled. We do, baby, she said. We really do. Spring settled gently over the city, wrapping the trees in fresh green leaves and warming the mornings with a golden light that seemed to stretch time itself. In David's home, it felt like life had finally stopped holding its breath. Rachel stood on the back porch barefoot, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She watched Sophie run through the yard with a pink kite trailing behind her, its string tugging gently against her small fist. David was a few feet away, pretending to be caught in the kite's tail, making exaggerated noises as he spun in circles to Sophie's delight. Laughter. Real, unguarded, contagious laughter. Rachel couldn't remember the last time it had sounded so normal. She turned and stepped inside, pausing by the entryway where photos now hung, some old, some new. One was a framed black and white image of Amy Blake, found in David's attic, restored and reprinted. Next to it was a picture taken just last week, Rachel, Sophie, and David on a picnic blanket. Sophie's face mid-laugh as David tried to catch bubbles in the wind. Rachel touched the frame, her fingers lingering. It still felt fragile, this piece, like it could slip away without warning. But it hadn't, and day by day it began to feel earned. Later that afternoon, while Sophie napped upstairs, Rachel and David sat on the living room floor with an open box between them, documents, photos, letters that once belonged to Elaine. Some were irrelevant, some heartbreaking, and one unexpected. A letter, unsent, dated 24 years ago, from Elaine to Amy. David unfolded it slowly, reading aloud. Amy, I hope you forgive me. I was scared. I wanted to help but didn't know how. I should have done more. If you ever read this, I want you to know, your child is not forgotten. I pray every day she finds her way home." Rachel closed her eyes. For so long she had believed she came from nothing, that her existence was accidental, lost in a system that didn't care. But now, someone had cared. Someone had tried. "She did find her way home," Rachel whispered. David looked at her. "Yes, she did." That evening, they cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad and garlic bread, Sophie smeared with butter. They ate on the back deck as the sun dipped behind the trees. Music played low from a speaker, and Sophie danced barefoot in the grass, spinning in slow circles, her laughter blending with birdsong. When Rachel looked at David across the table, she no longer saw a stranger. She saw her brother, someone who had chosen to stay, someone who didn't fix everything but helped carry the weight. "I never thought I'd say this," she said quietly, "but I feel rooted, like I belong somewhere." "You do," David said without hesitation. "Here, with us." Sophie came running back to the table, her arms wide. "Group hug!" Rachel laughed and pulled her in. David leaned in too, wrapping them both tightly in his arms. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was family. And for the first time in her life, Rachel no longer felt like she was surviving. She was living, and she was home. As the author, I believe the ending of this story speaks not to perfection, but to healing. The quiet, slow kind that comes from truth, connection, and earned trust. Rachel's journey from isolation and survival to a place of safety and belonging isn't a fairy tale. It's emotional realism. There's no magical rescue, no dramatic twist that fixes everything. Instead, there's a man who chooses responsibility over denial, a woman who chooses to trust again, and a child who becomes the bridge between what was lost and what can still be built. The twist, that family can be both a stranger and salvation, isn't meant to shock, but to reveal a deeper idea. Sometimes the most life-changing relationships aren't the ones we expect, but the ones we almost miss. To me, the most powerful part of the ending isn't the reunion itself. It's Rachel realizing she's no longer alone, and perhaps never really was. That quiet, enduring love, not romance, not wealth, but chosen family, is the heart of this story. And it's what stays with you long after the last page.